there. This left Trask wondering if the Mardukan Constitution hadn't been devised by Goldberg, the legendary old Terran inventor who always did everything the hard way. It always left him wondering just how in Gehenna the government of Marduk ever got anything done. Maybe it didn't. Maybe that was what saved Marduk from having a real despotism. Well, what prevents the government from enslaving the people? The people can't. You just told me that they aren't armed, and the government is. He continued, pausing now and then for breath, to catalogue every tyranny he had ever heard of, from those practiced by the Terran Federation before the Big War to those practiced at Eglansby on Amaterasu by Pedrosan Pedro. A few of the very mildest were pushing the nobles and people of Graham to revolt against Angus I. And in the end, he finished, the government would be the only property owner and the only employer on the planet, and everybody else would be slaves, working at assigned tasks, wearing government-issued clothing, and eating government food, their children educated as the government prescribes, and trained for jobs selected for them by the government, never reading a book or seeing a play or thinking a thought that the government had not approved. Most of the Mardukans were laughing now. Some of them were accusing him of being just too utterly ridiculous. Why, the people are the government. The people would not legislate themselves into slavery. He wished Otto Harkonnen were there. All he knew of history was the little he had gotten from reading some of Harkonnen's books, and the long, rambling conversations aboard ship in hyperspace, or in the evenings at Rivington. But Harkonnen, he was sure, could have furnished hundreds of instances, on scores of planets and over 10 centuries of time, in which people had done exactly that and hadn't known what they were doing, even after it was too late. "They have something about like that on Aton," one of the Mardukan officers said. "Oh, Aton, that's a dictatorship pure and simple. That planetary nationalist gang got into control 50 years ago, during the crisis after the war with Baldur." "They were voted into power by the people, weren't they?" "Yes, they were," Prince Bentrick said gravely. "It was an emergency measure, and they were given emergency powers. Once they were in, they made the emergency permanent." "That couldn't happen on Marduk," a young nobleman declared. "It could if Zaspar McCann's party wins control of the Assembly at the next election," somebody else said. "Oh, then Marduk's safe. The sun'll go nova first," one of the junior Royal Navy officers said. After that, they began talking about women, a subject any spaceman will drop any other subject to discuss. Trask made a mental note of the name of Zaspar McCann, and took occasion to bring it up in conversation with his shipboard guests. Every time he talked about McCann to 2 or more Mardukans, he heard at least 3 or more opinions about the man. He was a political demagogue. On that everybody agreed. After that, opinions diverged. McCann was a raving lunatic, and all the followers he had were a handful of lunatics like him. He might be a lunatic, but he had a dangerously large following. Well, not so large. Maybe they'd pick up a seat or so in the Assembly, but that was doubtful. Not enough of them in any representative district to elect an assemblyman. He was just a smart crook, milking a lot of half-witted plebeians for all he could get out of them. Not just plebes, either. A lot of industrialists were secretly financing him, in hope that he would help them break up the labor unions. You're nuts. Everybody knew the labor unions were backing him, hoping he'd scare the employers into granting concessions. You're both nuts. He was backed by the mercantile interests. They were hoping he'd run the Gilgameshers off the planet. Well, that was one thing you had to give him credit for. He wanted to run out the Gilgameshers. Everybody was in favor of that. Now, Trask could remember something he'd gotten from Harkonnen. There had been Hitler, back at the end of the 1st century pre-atomic. Hadn't he gotten into power because everybody was in favor of running out the Christians, or the Muslims, or the Albigensians or somebody? 20. Marduk had 3 moons. A big one, 1,500 miles in diameter, and 2 insignificant 20-mile chunks of rock. The big one was fortified, and a couple of ships were in orbit around it. The Nemesis was challenged as she emerged from her last hyperjump. Both ships broke orbit and came out to meet her, and several more were detected lifting away from the planet. Prince Bentrick took the communication screen and immediately encountered difficulties. The Commandant, even after the situation had been explained twice to him, couldn't understand. A Royal Navy fleet unit knocked out in a battle with space Vikings was bad enough, but being rescued and brought to Marduk by another space Viking simply didn't make sense. He then screened the royal palace at Malverton on the planet. First, he was icily polite to somebody several echelons below him in the peerage, and then respectfully polite to somebody he addressed as Prince Vandervant. Finally, after some minutes' wait, a frail, white-haired man in a little black cap of maintenance appeared on the screen. Prince Bentrick instantly sprang to his feet. So did all the other Mardukans in the command room. "Your Majesty, I am most deeply honored." "Are you all right, Simon?" the old gentleman asked solicitously. "They haven't done anything to you, have they?" "Saved my life, and my men's, and treated me like a friend and comrade, Your Majesty. Have I your permission to present, informally, their commander, Prince Trask of Tanith?" "Indeed you may, Simon. I owe the gentleman my deepest thanks." "His Majesty Mikhail the Eighth, Planetary King of Marduk," Prince Bentrick said. "His Highness Lucas Prince Trask, Planetary Viceroy of Tanith for His Majesty Angus the First of Gram." The elderly monarch bowed his head slightly. Trask bowed a little more deeply, from the waist. "I am very happy, Prince Trask. First, I confess, at the safe return of my kinsman, Prince Bentrick, and then at the honor of meeting one in the confidence of my fellow sovereign, King Angus of Gram. I will never be ungrateful for what you did for my cousin and for his officers and men. You must stay at the palace while you are on this planet. I am giving orders for your reception, and I wish you to be formally presented to me this evening." He hesitated briefly. "Gram, that is one of the sword worlds, is it not?" Another brief hesitation. "Are you really a space Viking, Prince Trask?" Maybe he'd expected space Vikings to have 3 horns and a spiked tail and stand 12 feet tall himself. It took several hours for the Nemesis to get into orbit. Bentrick spent most of them in a screen booth and emerged visibly relieved. "Nobody's going to be sticky about what happened on Audhulma," he told Trask. "There will be a board of inquiry. I'm afraid I had to mix you up in that. It's not only about the action on Audhulma. Everybody from the Space Minister down wants to hear what you know about this fellow Dunnan. Like yourself, we all hope he went to MC Square along with his flagship, but we can't take it for granted. We have over a dozen trade planets to protect, and he's hit more than half of them already." The process of getting into orbit took them around the planet several times, and it was a more impressive spectacle at each circuit. Of course, Marduk had a population of almost 2 billion, and had been civilized, with no hiatus of neo-barbarism, since it had first been colonized in the 4th century. Even so, the space Vikings were amazed, and stubbornly refused to show it, at what they saw in the telescopic screens. "Look at that city," Patrick Morland whispered. "We talk about civilized planets, but I never realized they were anything like this. Why, this makes Excalibur look like Tanith." The city was Malverton, the capital. Like any city of a contragravity-using people, it lay in a rough circle of